You know, when you watch a fiercely contested rivalry, like a derby match in football, you just assume the two teams on the pitch are complete opposites.
Right, because they wear different colors, their fans sing entirely different songs, and they just absolutely despise each other.
Exactly. You assume one has to win and the other has to lose.
It's the classic zero-sum game, right?
Yeah.
The lines are clearly drawn, and everyone's motivations seem completely transparent.
But imagine if you look closely at the scoreboard and realize that every single time either team scored a goal, the points were actually being awarded to a third team sitting miles away,
Completely off the field?
completely off the field. That would entirely change how you understand the game you're watching. And that is the really provocative reality we are unpacking today for you on this deep dive.
It is a fascinating premise.
It really is. We're exploring a deeply interesting Substack article by political analyst Roderick McMillan. And his central, just incredibly bold claim is that the real winner of the May 2026 Scottish election wasn't a Scottish party at all. He argues the winner was actually Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Which is quite the statement. And, before we go any further, it is vital to set the stage for how we are approaching this.
Yeah, definitely.
Today's source material dives into highly charged political territory involving both left-wing and right-wing parties in the UK.
So just to be crystal clear to you listening, we are not taking sides here, nor are we endorsing the author's viewpoints.
Exactly. Our job today is simply to unpack Macmillan's arguments, look at the evidence he presents, and impartially convey the ideas contained in the original source material.
Because to understand how the author arrives at that conclusion, you have to look past the surface-level rhetoric of the winning parties.
You really do. You have to examine what Macmillan calls the emotional architecture of modern politics.
Right.
It's about how political movements are built and who ultimately profits from their construction.
And to see how Russia supposedly benefits, we first need to look at the domestic playing field the author describes.
So let's look at those May 2026 Scottish Parliament election results. They gave us a really fragmented picture.
Yeah, they did. The Scottish National Party, or SNP, remains the largest party with 58 seats.
But they dropped 6 seats, so they're forming a minority government.
Right, but the massive shockwave of the night was Reform UK. They surged out of nowhere to grab 17 seats, tying for second place with Labour and completely overtaking the Conservatives.
And on paper, the SNP and Reform UK look like absolute polar opposites.
Oh, totally.
The SNP aggressively projects an image of civic, center-left, pro-European nationalism. They, wrap themselves in social liberalism and progressive values.
Whereas Reform UK, conversely, trades in right-wing anti-immigration grievance and this intense Brexit nostalgia.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's like looking at two completely different brands of energy drinks.
How so?
Well, one has sleek, progressive European-style packaging, and the other has aggressive, anti-establishment, traditionalist branding. But the author is arguing that if you look at the nutritional label, they are pumping the exact same emotional ingredients into the electorate. It's this promise to take back control.
Yes, the underlying formula is the same.
But I struggle with that a bit. I mean, how can a progressive pro-EU party and a right-wing Brexit nostalgia party actually be the same? One side is waving EU flags and the other is shouting about closing borders.
It's a very valid question, but he argues we shouldn't be looking at their policy platforms. We should be looking at their psychological playbook.
Okay.
It's not about their policies matching. It's about their methods rhyming. They both rely heavily on populist nationalism, which converts complex socioeconomic grievances into a total self-sealing theory.
He calls it the nationalist narrative model.
Exactly. Rather than a list of campaign promises, it's a sequence of emotional triggers. It usually starts with a heavy dose of nostalgia for a mythical, idealized past.
A time before things supposedly went wrong.
Right. And from there, the movement creates synthetic symbols of national identity to rally around and elevates certain figures into these untouchable folk heroes.
But the crucial engine of this entire model is the identification of a historical wrong.
Yes. The movement needs a specific scapegoat to blame for why the present isn't as glorious as that mythical past.
So Westminster, bureaucrats in Brussels, immigrants, the political elite, whoever fits the bill, the message is always, you have been robbed and they are the ones who did it.
And once that enemy is established, the movement offers voters a profound sense of belonging by rallying them to correct that historical wrong.
which creates a system where compromise isn't just a normal part of politics, it's viewed as total surrender.
Or treason. And independent experts who push back on the narrative are automatically dismissed as corrupt members of the establishment. They're bought and paid for, essentially.
So if these two opposing parties are using the exact same emotional playbook to divide the electorate, the next logical question is, who benefits from that division?
And Macmillan points directly to Moscow.
Right. To understand the mechanism of how Moscow benefits, we have to look at Russia's 2023 foreign policy concept.
Which is a document that heavily promotes a geopolitical framework they call multipolarity.
But if you strip away the academic jargon, the operational logic is actually quite simple.
It is. Russia knows it cannot outmatch NATO militarily, nor can it outmatch the EU economically, so it seeks to weaken them politically.
The author has this great quote to describe it. He says, "They don't light fires, they fan them."
Which is such a crucial distinction. Separatism, anti-migrant politics, culture wars, all of these are incredibly useful to them.
And the Intelligence and Security Committee's 2020 Russia report explicitly called this kind of Russian influence the new normal.
Yes, that report noted credible open-source commentary suggesting Russia interfered in both the 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the Brexit vote.
But wait, let me just ask a clarifying question here for you listening. Does this mean the author thinks your average Scottish voter is a Russian agent?
No, not at all. And he makes a very clear distinction to avoid exactly that trap. Russia doesn't need to turn SNP activists into intelligence agents or reform voters into sleeper cells.
Right, because that would be absurd.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that Moscow's goal is simply to degrade democracy's immune system. They just need societies to fracture along existing lines.
So the distraction, the endless arguing, the institutional exhaustion that is the strategic victory.
Right. Let's test this theory against the two parties, starting with the SNP.
Because this is where the theory encounters a major paradox. How does a party that actively and vocally supports Ukraine inadvertently serve Russian interests?
We definitely have to give the SNP credit where it's due. They have strongly supported Ukraine since the 2022 invasion.
Yeah, they set up the super sponsor scheme, welcomed refugees, provided financial aid. They are very visibly anti-Putin.
They are. However, the paradox lies in their defining goal, which is Scottish independence. Achieving that would inherently break up the United Kingdom.
And the UK is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a nuclear-armed NATO state.
Which brings us to the Faslane issue. The SNP wants to negotiate the removal of Britain's nuclear deterrent, Trident, from Scotland.
And removing that deterrent would cause massive geopolitical disruption.
Oh, absolutely. It would require decades of restructuring, billions in funding, and it would fundamentally alter the global balance of power.
Especially at a time when NATO is trying to project unity.
Exactly.
The author also details a huge contradiction regarding the EU. The SNP pitches independence as a way to rejoin the EU.
Right. But back in 2014, official EU leaders like Barroso and Reding stated clearly that an independent Scotland would have to leave the EU and reapply.
Which is a very long process.
Yeah.
But the SNP leadership pushed for the independence vote anyway.
They did. And then there is the Alex Salmond factor.
The former SNP First Minister.
Yes. The author notes that in 2014, Salmond told Alistair Campbell he admired certain aspects of Putin. And later, he accepted £30,000 a week to host a show on RT, the state-owned Russian propaganda channel.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the paradox of the SNP's stance is so glaring. It's like loudly protesting against a bank robber while simultaneously campaigning to dismantle the bank's vault door.
That's a great way to put it.
You might genuinely hate the robber, but structurally speaking, you're still making their job a lot easier.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the transition of independence would create immense uncertainty.
Yeah, years of negotiation, legal disputes, institutional distraction.
And these are exactly the conditions Moscow seeks. They want that distraction.
Right. But while the author paints the SNP as unwitting, useful idiots whose goals align with Putin's, he argues the evidence regarding Reform UK is much darker.
Much darker and much more direct. Reform UK is the descendant of the UKIP and Brexit party ecosystem.
And the rhetoric from their leadership is pretty explicit. Look at Nigel Farage's recent comments.
Right. In June 2024, he claimed the EU and NATO actually provoked Russia's invasion.
And then in January 2026, he said he would vote against deploying UK troops for post-peace security in Ukraine.
It mirrors the Kremlin's talking points very closely, but the most alarming evidence isn't just rhetoric. It's the bombshell case of Nathan Gill.
I couldn't believe this part when I read it. Nathan Gill was a former MEP and a leader in the UKIP, Brexit, and Reform Wales family.
Yes. And in 2025, he was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison for bribery.
10.5 years.
He took money from Oleg Voloshin and Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a close personal friend of Putin, specifically to make pro-Russian statements.
I mean, the hypocrisy is just staggering.
Yeah.
How does a movement that constantly shouts about taking back control and protecting national sovereignty reconcile with its own leaders literally taking bribes from hostile foreign powers?
It completely shatters the facade. The author quotes Justice Chima Grub from Gill's sentencing, who said, "When you say what someone has paid you to say, you are not speaking with sincerity."
That cuts right to the core of it.
It really does. It emphasizes how this directly validates the ISC Russia Report's warning, which is that democratic interference is simply not being treated with sufficient seriousness.
Okay, so we've seen how both parties fit into this global strategy, but what is the tangible cost to you?
The everyday citizen.
Yeah, the listener trying to navigate this political landscape. What does this all mean for them?
Well, the author argues that this populist nationalism forces a strict binary. It's always us versus them, yes or no, remain or leave.
And because of this absolute constitutional obsession, real pressing issues are just pushed into the background.
Poverty, housing, transport, education, they all get ignored while everyone argues about borders and flags.
The author points out that this is ultimately a class issue disguised as a national one, right?
Exactly. He notes that working-class voters in Glasgow have far more in common with working-class voters in Liverpool regarding their daily economic struggles than they do with affluent Edinburgh suburbs.
But the nationalist narrative forces them to view their neighbor as the enemy. So what does this all mean? Why do we, as voters, keep falling for the emotional drug of thinking that salvation is just one more constitutional rupture away?
This raises an important question, and it's the author's main call to action. We need to vaccinate ourselves against this manipulation.
To recognize the emotional pattern being used against us.
Yes, the humiliation, the betrayal, the salvation through rupture. We have to recognize it whether it's wrapped in a Scottish saltire or a Union Jack.
So just to recap the journey we've been on today, we explored a really compelling argument that by empowering populist nationalism, whether it's the civic left flavor of the SNP or the far right flavor of reform voters, inadvertently hands a strategic victory to Russian foreign policy.
By prioritizing division over fixing real, everyday problems.
Exactly. But by understanding the emotional architecture of these political narratives, you are now much better equipped to spot manipulation, regardless of which flag it waves.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on Macmillan's premise.
Yeah.
If hostile states like Russia exploit our pre-existing grievances by fanning the flames of division, what does that say about the social media algorithms we interact with every single day?
Oh, wow.
If those algorithms are fundamentally designed to prioritize the exact same outrage and us versus them binaries just to keep us engaged,
Right.
are the tech platforms on our phones acting as the ultimate automated useful idiots for foreign adversaries?
That is a fascinating and honestly kind of terrifying thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you are sold, and we will catch you next time.